Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back to continue our study of the Old Testament. We're at a most interesting section. This is chapters 13 through 16 of Exodus. This is the crossing of the sea. Now I'm going to lead off by reading something I wrote for my Sunday school class many, many years ago to try to take an event from American history and put it into Bible speak. That if you had written this 300 or 400 years later, like the Bible writers had, this is the way you may do it, because when you look at miraculous events are in the timing, in the interpretation, and your faith. So here's something from American history. I could come up with 2 or 3 more if we want. The forces of the evil king, the enemy of God and his people, struck cruelly at the armies of the Lord. And the armies of the Lord were shattered and thrown back in confusion and fear. The people cried out to the Lord, "Please protect us from this evil king and his evil servants." And God heard their cries and felt mercy for his people. And God spoke to his people and said to his people, "Fear not, for I will guide you into battle, and you will be triumphant." And God guided the forces of his people into battle. The Lord hid the forces of his people from the forces of the evil king. The Lord guided the forces of his people, and they smote the vessels and the men of the evil king from the sky and scattered his vessels over the sea. And the forces of the Lord struck triumphantly at the forces of the evil king, destroying them and conquering them completely. And the people cried out, "God is great and has given us great victories. Great is the name of the Lord." Now, when I read that to class, I would ask them what it was. No one ever guessed. That's the Battle of Midway. And the follow-up of what Japanese call the Pacific War, World War II in the Pacific. Having studied this many times, it was a truly triumphant victory, great unexpected victory. An incredible victory was the first book I read. That was the title of the first book. And discussing it with my father about 60 years ago, we both felt that the victory was divine intervention. We caught the Japanese where they didn't know we were there. We came in, they were rearming and refueling their planes on the flight decks of the carriers. Their fighter force was down on the deck attacking our torpedo planes, and the dive bombers came in and boom, boom, boom. In 5 minutes, set 3 of their carriers afire, and they all sank. The battle was essentially over in 5 minutes. So well, clearly there was great courage on both sides, great skill on both sides. Was this luck? Or was this divine intervention? In my opinion, it's divine intervention. So interpreting these kind of miracles, which are often very subtle, really comes down to your interpretation and your belief. The other great one from history is, if anybody's a history buff out there, and you got a Revolutionary War book, look up George Washington's escape from Long Island in the New York campaign in 1776. He shouldn't have got away, and he did, because of the way the Lord protected him. So we'll talk about these chapters where we're have just seen the death of the firstborn. Like I said last time, I can't explain exactly what happened medically. It sounds like a bubonic plague epidemic. I don't really know. And again, it's in the interpretation, not in the actual fact. Chapter 13 has some unusual things. First, it has the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And this is, and even though they did take unleavened bread with them, most likely, into the Sinai as they fled, the feast here actually dates from much, much later, about 600 years later, from the time of good King Josiah, around 640, 630. And he put in reforms, because the Unleavened Bread Festival was actually an agrarian festival that they developed after they had settled in and were farming in the Promised Land, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So, and remember, as we talked about, these books are constructs from different sources put together about 500 BC in the Babylonian exile. Then you have the dedication of the firstborn. I'm not exactly certain what the point of this is. They talk about dedicating the firstborn of your flock. I can understand that. You make the sacrifice of the firstborn of your primary animals to show your allegiance to the Lord. There's the dedication of the firstborn son to the Lord. I'm not certain what that means. It doesn't mean anything to me at this point, so I'm going to kind of gloss over it because I'm not certain what it's going to mean. Then we get to the departure of the Israelites. And they, after the death of the firstborn, they either escaped or were expelled. You can read it either way. Very well, they may have been expelled. You know, I always thought you just say, "Get out of here! I got enough of you guys." And they're taking off from where they were in the eastern part of the Nile Delta, and then they have a bunch of place names where they were, but nobody knows where these place names are, other than the capital of Ramses, which is in the eastern Nile Delta. And they name a variety of places where they go, and you really don't know exactly where they are. Then they come up to where they're being led in the daytime by a cloud at the front of the column and a pillar of fire at night. Some people have speculated that they were aiming toward an erupting volcano on the other side of the Gulf, all side of Sinai. That's possible. Other people have said they may probably have had a brazier, a fire pit they would carry with them and burn charcoal in it, and they had flames at the head of the column at night and it could follow the cloud in the daytime. That makes more sense for the timing, but it's really not entirely clear. And they go to a variety of places, and eventually they get and the Egyptians start after them. As I said about the Pharaoh last time, typical politician, he says one thing and then he changes his mind a few days later, and he sends the army out after them. And how well armed the Hebrews were at all, I don't know, if at all. Usually you didn't let your slaves have a lot of arms because they could rise up and revolt against you and try to kill you. So whether they probably didn't constitute a fighting force. And the only thing you know about the route is they didn't take the coast road. There's 4 routes across Sinai from time immemorial. One is the coast road, which they refer here as the way of the Philistines. Now, the Philistines weren't there at this time. The Philistines came in later. The Philistines were Greek-speaking survivors of the Mycenaean Greek kingdoms, which is what's in Homer's Iliad, if you're familiar with that. And those kingdoms collapsed about 1200, and the people took their boats out as raiders, marauders, and settlers, and the Philistines were Greek speakers. But they weren't there yet. But that road along the coast would have been too guarded by the Egyptian army. They would always have army posts out there to protect their border. And then there were 2 other routes across the Sinai, both of which would probably have been guarded. One of them had a lot of turquoise mines on it. And these were the 2 routes. One starts at the middle where the Suez Canal is and goes straight across over to Beersheba area, and the other one is farther south at Port Said, which is the northern end of the Gulf of Suez, and it cuts straight across to Eilat and Aqaba over that area. And then the 4th route, which is probably what they took, which goes down along the Sinai and into the center part of the Sinai, and is what's called the south central part of Sinai, where they could stay in the mountains. It's higher, it has some more rainfall, and it can support 10,000 people without much difficulty living there. So that's probably the way they went. But before they did that, they had to get across the water. So they camped one night next to what they call the sea. Now, it's unclear what sea this was. Remember that the term sea is used for any significant body of water in the Old Testament. The Sea of Galilee is really a modest-sized lake, nowhere even as big as Lake Erie. And they call it a sea. So you don't really know what this was. And in the 13th and 14th chapters, it refers to it just as the sea. Yam is the Hebrew word. So they're backed up against this, and the Egyptians come up behind them, and they move the fire column down behind the Hebrew column in between the Egyptians and them. And they did not attack them at night. It's very rare fighting at night in the ancient days. We fight at night now a lot because we have night vision goggles and all kinds of fancy technology. And we fought a little bit at night in World War II, not much in World War I, a little bit in the Revolution, not at all in the Civil War. So fighting at night's a modern thing. So they didn't fight at night because they couldn't see. They didn't have any artificial light. They didn't have lanterns and all that. So the Egyptians wait, and then the Lord tells Moses that he's going to drive the water back. So the wind, and if you read it carefully and go through skipping every third or fourth verse, you'll get a realistic explanation in the text of what happened. The pillar of cloud moved from their front and took position behind them. The cloud was dark, and the night passed without the one drawing closer to the other through the whole night long. And Yahweh drove the sea back with a strong easterly wind all night and made the sea into dry land. The Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians from the pillar of fire and cloud and threw them into confusion. Okay? He so clogged their chariot wheels that they drove on only with difficulty, which made the Egyptians say, "Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord Yahweh is fighting on their side against the Egyptians." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea as day broke, and the sea returned to its bed. The fleeing Egyptians ran straight into it. The returning waters washed right over the chariots and horsemen of Pharaoh's entire army. That day the Lord rescued Israel from the clutches of the Egyptians. Now that's going down through the verses to take out the extraneous stuff. And this is a reasonable hypothesis to what happened. They were probably up next to a lagoon or one of the bitter lakes. The bitter lakes are these tidal lakes. They're called bitter because they're brackish, half salt, half fresh. And they're vulnerable to the tide. So they're backed up against them. The Lord makes the wind blow the opposite way all night. The tide goes out, and the waters are gone. So they wake up in the morning. Moses runs around and kicks them. Get up, let's go, go. Because if you read before this, they had sat there and whined and fussed at Moses. "Oh, you brought us down here, we're going to die. We were better off back in Egypt." And so he's kicking them. "Get up, let's go." He was a tough desert warrior. They pack up their tents and their animals. They probably didn't have any carts. And they take across the mud flats, because that's what's underneath where the sea has been. You're going to have sea mud. So they take off across the mud flats, scampering along by the edge of what water's left, and heading for the dry land across there. Then the wind changes. The Egyptians go out on the mud flats with these heavy armored chariots. Remember, they had bronze armor on them. The warriors would have bronze armor on too. They get stuck in the mud because the heavy chariot goes whack down to your axle in the mud. They're whipping the horses, trying to get them to go. They pull out of the mud and they go a few feet and sink in the mud again. Then the wind changes and the tide comes back in. And lo and behold, they're in deep doo-doo. Okay? So a bunch of them probably drowned. Maybe some of them got away out the back. Very few people, if any, could swim in those days. You're wearing armor, you can't swim in bronze armor. The chariots are all stuck and the sea comes back in. And the Hebrews scamper over the hillside, more in amazement than anything. Now, the term used for this was yam, which is sea in Hebrew. When you get into chapter 15, it talks about, which is a victory hymn, which is clearly written 300 or 400 years later, after they've conquered Jerusalem, which is about 300 years later. And it talks about, there it calls it the Sea of Reeds, or Yam Sup. Now, the mistranslation of the Red Sea comes from this, because when the King James people, I've checked the King James version, King James tried to translate this. They didn't know what sup meant. They knew Yam meant sea. They didn't know what sup meant. So they looked at what little maps they had, relatively primitive maps in 1610, and they see the only body of water there is the Red Sea. They don't know about the Bitter Lakes and all that. And so they said, oh, okay, so they put Red Sea in here. But it wasn't the Red Sea. Yam Sup means the Sea of Reeds in a literal translation. Nobody knows exactly what that means. That's what sup means, is reeds. So here's the story of crossing the water. Was this a miracle? Absolutely. Did this forge them into a people? Yes. Did it stop them from whining and fussing at Moses? No! They spent the whole time in Sinai whining and fussing at Moses. How'd you bring us out here? We don't have any food. We don't have any water, blah, blah, blah. So they weren't all that courageous. Moses was. And so if you read it carefully, you can see it. And you can put it in believable terms. No different than in my opinion, the Battle of Midway or George Washington escaping the British at Long Island. When you get to the Song of Victory, this is clearly, as you get to the latter part of it, which is in verses 15 down through 19, you'll see references that come much, much later. They talk about the kingdom of Edom, the kingdom of Moab. These are rival kingdoms in the Palestine area, south in the Negev and east over in what's now Jordan. and they fought them for a couple hundred years, but well after the time of the Exodus. Then it makes a mention of a sanctuary on the mountain. You shall bring then and plant them on the mountain, which is your heritage, the place where you, the Lord, has made your dwelling, the sanctuary. And that's referring to Jerusalem, which is a mountain up. So this part of Exodus 15 is clearly written after King David had conquered Jerusalem, which is about 1000 BC. So it's probably 250, 300 years later. However, the oldest part of probably the whole Old Testament is right below it, which is in verse 21. This is the prophetess Miriam, that's Moses' sister, took up a tambourine, and all the women followed her with a tambourine dancing, while Miriam took them up from the frame. Sing to the Lord, for he has covered himself in glory, horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. So you would think, okay, well that'll everybody will be happy with Moses at this time, and everything's going to be hunky-dory. Well, of course, then you get down to the next thing, and they're after they escape across, scamper into the Sinai, then they start fussing, well, we don't have enough water to drink, why'd you bring us down here, it's all this desert. There's an odd incident at a place called Marah, nobody knows where this is, where they get there and there's a bitter water, probably alkali, could be brackish, I don't really know, nobody knows where this is. And Moses is able to, with the Lord's guidance, to cure the bitterness of the water by throwing a branch or log or a piece of wood into it. I can't explain that scientifically, but that's in there. And then come the interesting stories of the manna and the quail. They clearly live on manna for the 40 years between when they escape across the water and they attack Canaan from the south when they're from their later base at the Kadesh Barnea, which is an oasis just on the southern edge of the Negev Desert, south of the Holy Land. And the manna is produced particularly in the south central Sinai area, around where the historical Mount Sinai is, at St. Catherine's Monastery. There are succulent plants in the area which are produced. We'll discuss that next week about how you can have plants growing in this area. And the insects suck the succulent sap out, and they leave behind a residue, which is edible. And you come out in the morning before the heat comes up and melts it, and you scrape it off, and you can use that kind of as a flour to make an unleavened type bread, and you can live on that. And they use that for 40 years. So that's very common in the south central area around the traditional Mount Sinai, leading me to believe that's probably the site of where Mount Sinai is. All kinds of debate. There's been about 15 places suggested in all sorts of areas where that might be, probably down in the south central, because that can support this number of Hebrews. The quail is an interesting story. This is about quail arriving, and they're just sitting on the ground. You can come along and pick them up. And people said, well, this doesn't make any sense. Well, actually it does. The quail in those days would migrate from southern Europe across the Mediterranean, fly all the way nonstop, and land in the northern Sinai. And they're so tired from the flight, I don't know how long it takes them, but it's a long way to fly like a quail and land over there. You can walk along and pick them up. So when they're fussing they didn't have meat, they were able to pick the quail up at least at some time. Now the quail usually land in the more northern part of Sinai. Some people have speculated, well, maybe there were two exoduses, that one group snuck out into the northern route prior or after Moses had taken them out into the southern route. I don't really know. I think the wind, Lord just kind of gave them an extra wind, it pushed them a little bit farther south so they could pick them up as they were heading south, going down to Mount Sinai. So those are the two major sources of food, and this is the great miracle. This turned these people from poor, complaining, weak, vacillating slaves and forged them into a nation. This has been remembered throughout their history. They celebrate the Passover, and the Passover feast includes not only the Passover of the angel of death to spare the firstborn, but the escape from the Egyptians crossing the water. So exactly how this happened, I'm not certain. I think I've given you a reasonable explanation. of how it could happen in the normal context of life. The miracle is in the timing. The miracle, see, my own opinion is most of these miracles in life, which happen all the time, are actually fairly subtle. And if you don't have the right attitude to interpret them, you don't see the divine hand. I've always felt when you read these stories as a kid, you think, why is God intervening so aggressively in the lives of these people and not intervening in our lives? And I think it isn't any different. It's a matter of the interpretation. That God is intervening in our lives. I've done a couple of medical miracles, which I won't discuss with you. And there are other situations that I think are clearly divine intervention, like the Battle of Midway, like Washington escaping the British at Long Island, that are clearly divine intervention, but you've got to be looking for it. You've got to recognize the Lord's hand, and you've got to think that's often subtle, and it's in such a way that it can allow you to accept it with your faith or reject it in your attitude of rejection. So, yes, this was the great miracle. There's no question that something tremendously miraculous happened as they crossed the sea and escaped. And it really comes down to how you interpret it. So I'm going to stop here. We're going to read chapters 17 through 20. This will be getting down to Mount Sinai and the first of the covenants with God at Mount Sinai. We'll discuss the various routes where it probably is, and we'll begin to look at this. This is Dr. Guthrie. I'm going to stop here. I've enjoyed this one a whole lot. I hope you enjoy this as much as I did. Thank you very much.